Hi, everybody. Good afternoon and good evening. And thank you for joining us from different parts of the world today. I'd like to welcome you to the session on multiculturalism and creation of an anti-racist society, which is being hosted by Belong. Before I start off introducing today's panel, I'd like to thank the Australia-India Institute for giving us an opportunity to host the session at the India Week, which has been brilliant so far. We've been catching some sessions and truly loved the discussions so far. And we hope that you've been enjoying them as well. As far as this panel is concerned, as I said, this is being hosted by Belong, and we are a firm that promotes diversity and inclusion through our literature collective, mental health collective, and research collective. You can check out our work at www.belong.net. I'm also thrilled to announce that Belong has launched a new app called Another, which literally means the idea of unothering the other. And through the app, we aim to bring important book insights on gender, race, caste, ethnicity, sexuality, feminism, prejudice, religion, and other subjects through short format book summaries, interviews with authors and thought leaders, and the authors that you'll meet at the session today, their work is also on the app. You can download Another on your Android phones currently by simply looking for it on your Play Store or by clicking on the link pasted in the chat box below, which we'll shortly paste. We'll also be launching the iOS version of the app soon, so you can stay tuned to our social media channels to get all the updates. Again, we're posting the links to all these channels in the chat box. You can look at it. I'll first introduce myself. So I'm Lasya. I work as a partnerships and community manager at Belong. I'm also doubling up as your moderator for today's session because I previously worked as a writer and editor with Outlook Traveler, where I traveled across India and wrote, planned, commissioned, and edited over 27 books on India's culture, heritage, people, food, art, places, among others. And this topic of multiculturalism is of particular interest to me because to be honest, one can never get enough of exploring just how diverse India is. And countries such as the US, Australia, and India are especially known for being home to people from diverse backgrounds and identities. And India itself actually has been ruled and influenced by several dynasties and cultures. We've had so many different dynasties. We've had people coming in from South Asia, Central Asia. We've even had the French, Dutch, Portuguese, and of course the British. And each of these dynasties and cultures has actually left their mark on the country, and it probably dictates how the country is even today. And if there's one thing that I actually discovered while traveling to every nook and corner of this country, it's that although the food, religion, cultures, heritage, architecture, languages, literature, and even people's appearances and race and topography changes every few hundred kilometers, the people of this country and the essence of this country is essentially very similar, and people are all very, very similar to each other. And we actually want to discuss the very same multiculturalism and creation of an anti-racist society today through this session. And we have two excellent panelists with us who will help us understand this better. And super excited to introduce you to Arunava Sinha, our first panelist for today. Arunava translates Bengali literature into English and English and other literatures into Bengali. Over 60 of his translations have been published so far. His translations have won several awards in India and have been shortlisted for a number of international awards. He teaches creative writing and translation at Ashoka University in Sonipat near New Delhi. And he's also the book editor at scroll.in. Our next, thank you so much for joining us today, Arunava. Our next speaker is Varud Gupta. Varud is an award-winning author of the graphic novel Chhotu, A Tale of Love and Partition, for which he also won Comic-Con India's Best Writer. And he also has written the travelogue Bhagwaan Ke Pakwaan, Food of the Gods. His words also frequently appear in National Geographic Traveler and Mint Lounge. His career as a writer began after quitting a short-lived stint as a management consultant to travel and eat his way across the globe. When not writing, he enjoys traveling, experimenting in the kitchen, collecting instant noodles, or playing Dungeons and Dragons. And if you want to follow Arunava's work, you can follow him on Twitter. We've posted Arunava's Twitter handle here. If you want to follow Varud's work, you can follow him on Twitter. We've posted his handle as well. If you want to follow Varud's instant noodles collection, you should follow him on Instagram. You can look up Varud on Instagram. So thank you so much, both Varud and Arunava, for joining us today from different places. and truly excited to start this session. And I would actually like to start off by asking you that one rather stereotyped question on, because the word, as I mentioned, multiculturalism could be overused sometimes. But I want to understand from each of you, what is your idea of multiculturalism really like, and how do you personally and even professionally like to explore the multiculturalism in India the most? And also, if you could tell me afterwards, what is the lens that you adopt, and how does it build your perspective? Either of you could start, whoever's ready.
Varud,
Want to go ahead? Okay. Multiculturalism. I think with the thank you everyone for joining us, and I apologize. It is 3:30 a.m. my time, so if I fumble on any words during this, please forgive me. But yeah, multiculturalism. I think both the projects that I've worked on, Bhagwaan Ke Pakwaan and Chhotu, have this topic at heart. With Bhagwaan Ke Pakwaan, it was very much about us traveling to different communities around India. We spent time with tribes in Meghalaya to understand, how do they balance the traditional faith and the emerging modernism in their society, the idea of Buddhism north of India, and like how it developed local flavors as it was adopted in the country. And I think one thing that became very important for me was asking myself, what does it mean to be Indian? And I think for me, it was, I didn't grow up in India, I grew up in the States. And so at first, when I came in with this lens, it was like, okay, what does it mean for me to be Indian? And I found like that topic itself is still convoluted. It's so complex. As we explore in that book, we have so much diversity in this country to explore. And I think Chhotu takes a very different lens at it. We'll talk about the partition and kind of its associations today in modern India. But I think the idea of the strife and the politics and the power plays that happened in 1947. We know we're only just a couple of days away from Independence Day, so it's a very topical subject to be exploring, but how has that actually influenced the idea of what does it mean to be Indian? And I think the celebration of diversity, and as we talk about travel, travel has, for me, been that lens, being able to experience different perspectives, cultural identities. I think that for me is a very important aspect of figuring out whatever multiculturalism really is.
Thanks, Varud. Arunava?
Yes, thanks. I think for me, my approach to multiculturalism, quote unquote, I think it's probably been in two ways. Like most of us who live and have grown up in India, it's very much a part of our daily life. But perhaps because it is a part of our daily life, we tend not to think of it in those terms. It takes some distancing and thinking to realize, wow, this is not what many cultures or many societies around the world experience. They're much more uniform or much more monolithic. I think we took diversity and everything that came with it for granted. I grew up in Calcutta, which was a city of migrants, both because of the partition, first in 47, then the 1971 War of Liberation in Bangladesh, and also a constant inflow of people in search of greener pastures from the neighboring states. And it was very normal to be in a space of linguistic, social, class, economic, and indeed, if you add them all up, cultural diversity. The other thing that happened to me was, of course, when I started translating literatures and I realized that India is so many different literatures. Even the term Indian literature doesn't make any sense because it is so much people say that there are two ways in which you can bring ingredients together, right, Varud? When you're cooking, one is the salad bowl and the other is the melting pot. And India is very much a salad bowl rather than a melting pot where everything becomes uniform. So each constituent maintains its own identity. And that is what I found when it came to literatures as well, that every aspect of literature, both if you slice it up regionally, linguistically, and even within each language, if you looked at where it was coming from, where the author belonged, which section of society, which class, unfortunately, caste is still very much a strong presence in India. Which part of the state geographically, which version of the language they speak. All of it added up to a almost bewildering variety. And then it became obvious that, what the translated literatures of India were doing was enabling the maintenance of this variety and the package of culture that comes with each of them. In contrast to this, if you look at Indian writing in English, it seems to reside in a slightly secular kind of space, which does not directly draw its roots from any of the ground level cultures of society. So it has created a new space for itself, which many of us occupy, which many of the urban elites occupy, and many others aspire to occupy. But that is not, that is only a top layer. Just go beneath it, and then you have these very, very different kind of cultural systems. And inevitably, the literatures for me reveal where the cultures came from, why they came so much from their economic realities, from their interactions with other sections of society, from their visibility or their invisibility, as the case might be. So this is what multiculturalism means for me in a very personal way. I encounter it every day in the work that I do.
Thank you so much, Arunava. That was a great answer, and I really like the way you pointed out about how you often take it for granted very soon when you're living in the middle of it. And on the other hand, Varud spoke about how it was not where he grew up. So for him, it was an exploration. So that's probably why I'm actually very interested in this session already, because we just have authors who are both Indian but come from two different perspectives. So. And before I ask my next question, I'd actually like to tell the audience that we will be taking in questions about 30 minutes from now. And that would be around that would be around 7:10 p.m. AEST and around 3:45 p.m. 2:45 p.m. IST. So I'd request you to leave any of the questions that you may have in the Q&A box. We might not actually see the chat box for your questions very often. If there is some other kind of communication that you want to have, you can have it on the chat box. But please leave your questions to the authors and the panelists on the Q&A box that you can see at the bottom. Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, so just moving on to my second question. And I really, and that actually makes sense because Varu just mentioned the Independence Day, and with that comes the conversation of partition. We're 3 days away from India's Independence Day, and so my question is, both of you have either written or translated works that are deeply related to the partition of India that happened in 1947. And I thought it would be a great way to start off, actually, while India's context of multiculturalism goes back 3,000, 4,000 years, and it's not really easy to have that conversation in an hour. It would be easier to actually contextualize it with respect to what are the kind of changes that have happened in the country, or what remains intact in the last few decades since the British left the country and since the country got divided. And since both of you have worked with partition literature, I wanted to understand from you, the first thing is, how do you see whether the writing that you explored back then, how do you see the difference in the way literature was written in 1947 or around that time to now? Do you see a difference in psychology of people and of how writers are approaching it? And do you see a difference in the way it is written differently by people from different parts of the country, or it's experienced differently by people from different parts of the country? What has your personal experience been like exploring or researching literature from that time, and the culture that comes with it? Varud again.
Cool. So I don't think I'm as well read as Arunava on this subject, but I think one thing that I found particularly interesting when I was doing the research for Chhotu was when it came to the news. And when we talk about differences, I'm actually going to harp on similarities, because one major inspiration point that came for me for this book was drawing very clear parallels between the idea of fake news or the idea of news influencing biases. For me, when I think of 1947, a lot of it was for me as an outsider coming to a country that I hadn't had the time to explore. And I did this through interacting with my grandfather. So my Nana grew up in Chandni Chowk. And for me, it was the idea of how do we unpack biases that have been deeply seated within the community? And it'd be obviously way too rosy for me to say, like, before 1947, that everything was great in the country, right? We see that in the US today, racism exists under many different layers. And it just takes inflammation and kind of strife to bring it to the surface. But interesting about 1947, I think a lot of those biases were inflamed in that moment, and they've propagated to today. And I think it's very easy to see the parallels of people misusing faith, communal strife, for the pushing of power and politics, unfortunately. And so I think when I was looking at 1947, I saw so many similarities between just what people were going through and how perspectives have kind of been malaligned through those times.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Arunava.
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, Varud, I'm not an expert either. I've just read a few books here and there and a few that I've translated. But so I'm going to talk about this through one specific book, because I think that's at least a more authentic version. This is a book written by Manoranjan Bapari, who's a Dalit writer from Bengal, and who has written his autobiography as well as put this in fictional form, where he talks about the migration of his family from what became East Pakistan to what became West Bengal a couple of years after the partition. First, one of the most interesting things I now see, and maybe a lot of this has to do with political instigation, that independence has taken a backseat in the popular memory to the partition. When we grew up, frankly, in the 1970s and 80s, we knew of the trauma of the partition and its scars, but it really was not a wound that had been opened up or that was festering at any point of time. Independence was more important. The fact that India had broken free and was charting its own path, that somehow seemed to be the thing that we were more concerned with. But over the past 10 or 15 years, the partition, with all its religious fault lines, has become a big subject of discussion in a very distorted manner in order to achieve political ends. So not even sure that what we now consider memories are genuine memories or whether they're implanted by the propaganda that has been passed around. So that's important to remember. And perhaps it's a good idea to go back to the sources, to source material, to read more about it and maybe talk to people in our own families to see what their memories of partition are. So going back to Vyapari's situation, so he belongs to, as I said, a Dalit, and therefore a caste which is not considered quite up there by other Hindus, or certainly was not at that point of time. So their family actually were not the first to migrate. The first people who migrated from on both sides were the rich people, because they were the ones who could actually afford to move, knowing that they would be able to start a new life elsewhere. There was a lot of, in the eastern side, there was a lot of exchange of houses, because a lot of Muslims and Hindus lived in Calcutta, and a lot of Hindus and Muslims lived in Dhaka, for example. They actually spoke to one another and decided to exchange houses so that when they went across to the other side, they would be able to live, start a life immediately. But for very poor and deprived people like Vyapari's family, there was no such facility. So when they eventually came across the border, they were not wanted. And that's the key point, that contrary to believe that India became this great welcoming place for all Hindus, or that, for that matter, Pakistan became this great welcoming place for all Muslims, neither was the truth. Poor people were not wanted in either of the two places. And when they went over or they came over, they really had to fight. And if you look at Vyapari's trajectory, as he mentions in his autobiography, they were shunted around from camp to camp, living in the most inhuman possible conditions. People died all the time. First, they were put in a camp in, I think, Purulia, where Vyapari himself was thought to have died at the age of 3. And then he was going to be, when children died, they were just put out, their bodies were put out in the forest because there were no facilities for cremation. So since it was the middle of the night, they waited till the morning, and by the morning he was stirring again. So he hadn't died. Then they were moved to this camp in what is now Chhattisgarh, Dandakaranya, which is now in the state of Chhattisgarh. And even then later, the Bengali-speaking people were moved to an island in the Sundarbans called Morinchapi. And in all of these places, the effort was to get them out of there. It was never about welcoming and allowing them in. So if you look at the culture of partition, it wasn't so much about welcoming everyone as it was about keeping only people like yourself around you, and really try to throw away the people who are not, not PLUs. as it went. That was very much a case because there was this gigantic wave of people. Even in Bengal, if you look at it, the city of Calcutta did not welcome the first influx of refugees from East Pakistan. They had to move to the southern parts, borders of the city, where they had to just somehow find land, put up little hovels, and live in abysmal conditions, to so much so that those areas began to be called the colonies. And to this day, that part of Calcutta is still considered to be home of refugees or the children of refugees now, and so on, till the real estate boom took over. So, this kind of thing automatically created a huge cultural divide. And that cultural divide has passed on, it's been inherited. And even today's generations of Bengalis in Calcutta still consider themselves, Bangal or Ghoti, as the case might be, meaning I'm from East Bengal or I'm from West Bengal. 70 years ago, their ancestors might have migrated, but that identity has not gone away. So it very clearly shows that the walls have been put up and the walls have not, there been no attempt to bring the walls down really. And the literatures bring this out very, very clearly. There's a bunch of books on the, unlike on the Western front, where the books, literature, so much to do with the violence. On the Eastern side, the literature is not so much about the violence, but it is about displacement. So it is much more internalized. It is much more long sagas of families who had to leave everything and go to a new place and start afresh, and what that meant. So very different view of the partition in the literatures of Bengal.
Right.
Absolutely. I'm going to add something really quick. You said something very interesting, the idea of the memory of partition. And I think right now it is taking a center stage, but in trying to find the bright side of it, I think it's also a time where we have a generation that's still alive that experienced the partition. And I think now is more crucial than ever to actually be taking those stories, the oral histories, and unpacking them. Because one thing that I experienced, and it's very personal and might not be true for everyone, when I was writing the story of Chhotu with my grandfather, when we first started talking about that time, it was about communal strife. And it took discussion after discussion after discussion to build up the entire world, the other perspectives, the lifestyles, and back to the topic today, the diversity and the multiculturalism that we should be celebrating in the country. And so I think one thing that was rewarding for me was to be able to sit and unpack it with the generation that still experienced it. Because when we talk about history, when we talk about how this moment will be remembered into the future, I think right now is kind of a flux point of, what do we attribute to the partition? Is it just the bad memories, or is it the nuances, as you said, the displacement and migration? It wasn't just about communal strife.
Yeah. And I was actually going to also add the fact that in one of our previous sessions, Varud was talking about the partition and mentioned about how people are also probably unpacking the stories now because the trauma attached to it is probably slightly lesser, or people have dealt with it, or the other generations are more capable of extracting a different story, or people are actually talking about it. So that's also a perspective that I thought was very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing these stories. And also, before we actually move on to my next question, Arunava, there's a question about Vyapari's book. Which particular book are you talking about when you're talking about this story, the independent story? Is it the Runaway Boy, or?
So it's in his autobiography, which has been translated into English as Interrogating My Chandal Life. It is also in the first volume of a new 3-volume autobiographical work of fiction. The first volume is called The Runaway Boy. It was published earlier this year. You will encounter it in both these volumes.
All right. Thank you so much. Sujata, I hope your question is now answered. Thank you. So I was actually going to ask you the next bit of my multiculturalism come independence or colonial era questions, which is not more about the partition, but more about, since both of you have worked with books from around that time, what is it that from the multiculturalism or racism perspective, what is it that you think has been a hangover or sort of an inertia of the British rule that's probably still exists today? And how do you think the fabric of the country has changed in the last 70, 80 years when you actually zoom out and look at the situation as a whole, right? Like, how do you think it has changed? Has it from the stories that you have explored from that time. It could be macro or micro, if you want to share with us, or whatever that's more comfortable with you. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Okay. I don't have a very comprehensive view on this, or a very learned view, but one of the things that I have observed is that I think all of us grew up on the idea of enlightenment and knowledge as the way it was brought to us by our colonial rulers. And that pretty much persisted, I think, persists even now. So our view, our ontological view of India is colored or shaped by a Western tradition, which itself is not a product of multiculturalism. So as a result, we have tended to see things not in terms of, not by disaggregating, but by aggregating. One size fits all, and there is this whole notion that historicism is an inevitable path that all cultures and all countries must tread, and sooner or later they will get to that point where everybody else has got, and that model is set by the West, and that I think has done a great disservice to our understanding of our own country and our own cultures. We've ignored a lot of things as a result of this, because we've tried to push everybody onto the same path of development and progress, which was very much a Nehruvian view and perhaps an understandable view at that point. But since then, I think we could have studied ourselves, studied our own cultures and diversity better. We have failed to do that. And even today, we are not trying. We are actually, right through, we are trying to be monolithic and impose one vision over everybody. So, the Nehruvian cultural vision was outside of, very much like Indian writing in English, outside of the specificities of local aspirations and local aesthetics. It in fact, it ushered in an aesthetic modernism without a corresponding modernism in society. Society had not progressed to the point that the aesthetics were suggesting that they do. So what was privileged was the kind of literature and cinema and art that had this space outside of these specificities. And that I think we've suffered from in a big way, with the result that I'm not even sure how important it is to think of India as one country, because it is, that is a way to actually ignore the diversities. It would be far better to think of ourselves as the United States of India. I feel like the way America does, than as, we refer to the central government. I would much rather call it the union government, for example. But these are things that we, either you go towards them in a planned way, or you go towards them the hard way, through strife. And today, if you're seeing an actual land dispute between two neighboring states, which is a very rare situation, it is because we have not acknowledged differences. So that I think is where we've gone terribly wrong, and because of our colonial legacy.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you said got me thinking of something else that I'm working on right now. And it's the idea that when colonial powers came in, whether it's British or Dutch or Portuguese, a lot of what was considered cultural of the continent before then got colored and distorted or lensed through their perspective. And it applies to so many things other than just the partition. Recently, I was reading about Devdasis, right? And how it was kind of this very amazing cultural form, right? The studious, the tutelage they would go through, the art forms that they would study. And unfortunately, during a certain period, they became associated with temple dancing girls, and a reduction of kind of the amazingness of that used to exist. I think we've also seen it with Hinduism, practices, how it got kind of colored through colonial times. I say that, but at the same time, I feel like a fallacy that we kind of go through sometimes is the British blame game. I know a lot of people like to play blame on the past. And I think as a country for India, you're correct. We need to be looking at the diversity. There's so many nuances and complexities to this place. It's kind of what captivates me as an individual who didn't get a chance to grow up in the country. I just think there's so many historical moments. There's so many beautiful cultural aspects of the country that we should be digging into. We should be uncovering, and we should ask ourselves, what was the distortion that it went through during that period? What's the original form? How did it benefit or be taken away from during that time?
Yeah. Thank you so much for your answers. Those have been extremely rich answers. I'd actually now start. I now maybe moving on from partition and independence and the British itself. I actually had some questions for a few different questions for Arunava and Varud both, and these are more related to your particular work and how that fits into the context of anti-racism and multiculturalism. So I just like to go with Arunava first. So Arunava, I actually wanted to understand from you, what is a role? I know you mentioned translation and what job it's doing before briefly, but if we were to dig deeper, what is really the role that translation plays in exploring the idea of multiple cultures and traditions and lived experiences in India? And I'm so glad you brought up Manoranjan Vyapari's books, and you also we've also had a discussion with you before where we spoke about how you translate a lot of work from women writers, etc. So so what is really what has really your learning been in even attempting to understand so many different perspectives and cultures and languages, and through translations? What really happens? Tell us the process. Is it deliberate? How do you work around it? And where do you draw the line, or where do you say, okay, this is just beyond my understanding? Do you have those moments?
Yeah. So, the best thing about translation in terms of forming a relationship with a different culture is that it forces you to listen. You cannot talk. Which is the most important thing, perhaps, in understanding. I know we all talk about dialogue and so on, but sometimes it is very important to just shut up and listen with all your might and all your attention. So this is what translation makes you do. You've got a text in front of you and you're listening to the text and you're listening to the voices in it. So it perhaps brings you into a situation where you are not um, you're not proving a point. You're just trying to find out what's going on there, and it leads to some extraordinary discoveries. Now, there's so many ways to look at the cultural divide, but one of the most important ones in India is surely gender.
Right.
And one of the things I've discovered from closely reading texts by women, which I translated, is that really men hugely exaggerate their importance in the lives of women. They are far less necessary than they believe. And because they've been calling the shots, they've somehow created this illusion that, without men, women can't function, and therefore, but the truth is nothing can be further from the truth. And which is why you often see these of these futuristic women-only societies, right? As far back as Begum Rokia Sultana, where she wrote Sultana's Dream, she was writing about a society that comprised only women and no men at all. So that's one of the big learnings and big findings, and it really helps you also put yourself, because we are also all male. I mean, those of us who are of the male gender have also inherited many of the assumptions and biases. And I'm not sure that with every generation it gets better, but I'm not sure that my generation has quite overcome, or even I can't even claim personally that I've overcome everything, although one tries. So that's one. The other thing is, when you translate people who are writing from the margins, then you get a very different perspective on the same world that you occupied. I know I keep going back to Manoranjan Vyapari, but I can't help it. The last novel of his that I translated, the entire novel is set in the slums around the railway lines in the southern part of Calcutta. And until I read this book, I was literally not aware of this. I mean, I'd seen the slums, but that it was invisible to the rest of us. It's an invisible city, but it's a full city with its own social, political, economic, psychological, moral framework and systems. And I actually had to seek entry. I mean, with the author's help, I said, look, can you help me just walk around and maybe see things, because I am not sure I can do justice to this translation unless I get a little bit of the sense of how you were looking at it. Of course, I don't think I could go anywhere near that. And that is where the skill of the text lies. If a writer has done a terrific job, then they are allowing you to enter their world and see the world through their eyes. right? Because you can't live everybody's life for themselves, but the book allows you to do that. So that's the skill of the writer, and a translator will then try to take that across through a different language. But at the same time, it was for me a revelation to just spend a little bit of time as an outsider, but just to be aware of the existence of these things instead of passing them by. So, translation has been a tremendous entry point for me, both theoretically and in one or two cases in practical terms, into worlds that I would not have been part of. And in India, as I suppose anywhere else in the world, it's very easy to live in your own self-contained, on your own self-contained layer and not be aware of things. Like, just as we are also not very aware of what goes on among the super rich, it's the same way we are not aware of what goes on among those below the middle class, and that is the vast majority of India in every sense. So translating is a little bit of a way of getting into these spaces from bridging every divide. And gender and class are just two I mentioned. The third, of course, is language, which automatically leads to region. So, increasingly India is becoming linguistic islands. People from one who use one language do not understand people who use another language. There was a time in the past when people were genuinely biliterate or even triliterate. Those days are gone. Kannan Sundaram, who publishes books in Tamil, told me recently that it's been 20 years since he's had a request for somebody to translate a book from Tamil into Bangla. So there are no more people left to understand both languages well enough to be able to translate from. And this is a huge thing that we are losing out on. And while English may work in a limited way, we are completely losing out on the ability to understand one another through literature. Interestingly, cinema is bridging that gap now. There is a new sort of trend of Malayalam films, which everybody watches, and thanks to perhaps the OTT services, a lot are watching Malayalam film, which they didn't do in the past, or they only watch art film. So I think that itself is another great way of entering into a different cultural space.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that answer, Arunava, and love the way it ended. Huge. I watch a lot of those movies from other languages as well. And so we also have a lot of questions coming in from the audience. So I have a couple of more questions left for the speakers, and after that, we'll quickly move on to the audience questions. So Varud, the next questions for you, and you also spoke a little bit in the beginning about growing up in the US and coming here and exploring Indian culture. And this question is more about, could you break down the process again, like I asked Arunava, what has it really been like leaving the corporate world, leaving a management consultant job to explore food? Where did it all start? And do you remember what it was particularly that helped you nosedive into the whole process?
Yeah, the movie Ratatouille for me. That movie itself has had like a profound effect on my life, and I think that's where also comes the idea, like the power of storytelling. Simple things that a Pixar movie has conveyed amazingly has had a change on my life, and I think as a storyteller, I mean, there's no greater thing that I could possibly do than impacting one change in perspective or belief of someone who picks up a book. And I think what Arunava said is amazing. With these stories and the traveling that I did, it was very much a checking of my own privilege. And I think when we talk about multiculturalism in a country like India, we have so many different dimensions of exploring it. And literacy and class and socioeconomic background is a big aspect of that. It took me a while to realize that writing in English, obviously off the bat, it's a big subset of people who actually pick up books in India. Us here talking in English on an online digital platform creates another more of a subset itself. And I think traveling to me, when I decided to jump ship and travel, it was checking my privilege and expanding a bubble of that I had existed in. And I think that is traveling in its purest form offers you that. I'm sure you've experienced the same with all the traveling that you got to do in India, is that it allows you to, for even the briefest of moments, step into another person's shoes, perspective, and lifestyle. And obviously, it's not encapsulating, right? You can't really truly experience what they've been through, but I think the small glimpses add up. And for me, I was going through that weird period of questioning existentialism and purpose and everything. And so that's where Bhagwaan Ke Pakwaan came in, right? It was food and faith combined together. And so it was a very natural journey that I was going on at that time.
Thank you so much. I actually have an additional question to that, since we mentioned food, and somebody's also talking about food on the Q&A box, and I thought we should give it more space at this panel. So there's one thing I actually, since you wrote Bhagwaan Ke Pakwaan, and there's one thing that I actually noticed about food in this country, and if I had to give a small example of it, like the flavor notes across the country change, right? Like with every state, the flavor changes. And if you take something as simple as a dish called the bamboo chicken, which is literally cooking chicken inside the bamboo, you think that it's a Naga dish, but it's actually made across the tribal belt of Eastern India, right? Like Andhra Pradesh makes it and it's called Bongolo chicken. Odisha makes it called Bosa chicken, goes all the way up to Arunachal, down to Nagaland. The same dish with different flavors. And when I actually made the discovery over a few years of traveling to different states, I realized that, we're all the same. We're literally all the same, like whether it is south of India in Andhra Pradesh or extreme northeast in Changlang district in Arunachal Pradesh, right? Like we're just all eating the same food. Have you had any of those food related discoveries when you were exploring different places for Bhagwaan Ke Pakwaan?
Yeah, absolutely. I can extrapolate that to even outside of India. I think at some primal form, like cultures have just so many similarities of food. And I think one is it obviously comes from a very biological survival perspective, but food as being such a tangible thing in our lives, it goes across senses, nostalgia, comfort, just the emotions that get attached to food. And I think that's a very universal thing about food. It's something that I particularly like. I like to say like Bhagwaan Ke Pakwaan, it's like actually diversity package behind food, because food is just like a lens at exploring these different places. And I think that's the true brilliance of eating and exploring the world from a food angle is you understand, I don't know if I'm applying this right, but like same, but different, I feel like is a slogan you'd apply here. Like there's so many similarities and that small twist, but there's that universality that really exists with cuisine.
Yeah. Thank you so much for answering that. I actually have a very small question to kind of wrap up this segment of the discussion, which is I wanted to understand what according to you, whether it is since we spoke so much about diversity within multiculturalism, I wanted to delve deeper into what, according to you, are the binding factors that may help or are currently helping create that anti-racist society that, seems like an egalitarian idea of, what is it that, and it could be totally from your perspective, what are the cultural binders in this country or even outside when you notice that bring people closer together or bring cultures closer together, whether it is through your work or through your personal experiences? What do you think those are? Either of you could go for it. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm just gonna jump in. I don't know if I have a short answer to it, but as someone who's bounced around, I think of belonging and identity a lot. It's something that it's in my mind. It comes with stories like, am I the right person to be telling a story? And one thing that recently I've been kind of contemplating is that we have these terms as Indian, we have these terms as geographic, but I think understanding that there's a lot more nuances to each of these things. One thing I realized while doing the hostel circuit was that you have people from all across the world that are going through the exact same existential crisis that I am across age groups. And I think understanding that, whether you're from a different country or a different background, there are similarities at the end of the day that kind of remain across for all of us.
Right. Thank you so much. Arunava?
Look, I'm no expert, but again, if I go into what I've seen in the books that I've read and translated, and a little bit around me, it's sad, but I think it's a shared misery that unites us in a big way. The fact that many of us have been or not us, but people have been at the receiving end of things brings them together. I think success leads to competition. People feel that it's a zero-sum game, and that therefore, if I have to succeed, you have to fail. But when it comes to just coping, when it comes to survival, then there is strength in numbers. People band together, they work together. And at that point, I think that unity of the human condition actually overrides everything else. That's one. The other thing, of course, is that, for us, it's very difficult to imagine what it was like for generations to live under British rule. So we have no idea what sense of being an Indian, what being an Indian meant at that point of time. Even the idea of being an Indian perhaps came into being only after independence, because you had all these princely states who considered themselves independent units on their own. And so I don't really know. I think generations today are far more attuned to the idea that, okay, we are all Indians, and there's some shared stuff which has to do with culture is a bit amorphous, but what is probably tangible is things like an Olympic gold medal or cricket or Bollywood to a great extent. So there are all these markers which somehow make you feel a kinship. And the other thing, of course, as Varud will know, is that when you go abroad, you suddenly become a very, you relate to other Indians very closely, inevitably, right? You feel your alienness in a different space. So yeah, I mean, this is not a very profound answer, but I don't really have deep thoughts on this.
I think you did touch upon something really profound, is that the idea of being Indian is actually a very relevant concept. Right? If you go even like a few hundred years back, the idea of being Indian doesn't exist. But there are some things like Shah Rukh Khan, which unites us all. I remember walking through the street in Peru, and DDLJ was playing on a DVD player. And I was like homesick. It was my birthday, and I remember, wow, there is DDLJ playing. There's like the mustard field scene, right? And I was like, yes, this makes me more Indian than the term Indian itself, or the geography.
Yeah. It's also, I need to be the devil's advocate here. If you go down south, people don't even know what DDLJ is. So it's just like,
there you go.
People can't speak Hindi. Like, why should I, right? It's just like I have seen people who don't know what Kabhi Kushi Kabhi Gum is, and that's shocking to me, but people don't. So it's just
yeah. No, it is true. The idea of Indian is often conflated with North Indian. Yeah, that's a fact.
True.
Yeah, it's also probably one of the ways, like we discussed, to find the unifying element. I actually had a bunch of other questions, but I probably can't ask them anymore, and I'll probably try to take some of the many audience questions that have been coming in here. So the first question comes from an anonymous attendee, and the questions are more on the lines of, I think, I probably want to just divide these questions up. Maybe Arunava, this is probably talking about migration and survival. So it talks about when people migrate from one place to another, they learn the local language for better survival. But can we say they also try to escape or avoid the racism through it? For example, migrants from UP and Bihar, after coming to Punjab, learn Punjabi, and then they also carry it everywhere rather than their own language. So learning a local language, is it a choice, or is it a way to avoid discrimination in something that's, is it a question that either of you feel comfortable answering?
I'm not sure I am in any authority to answer this question. I mean, my experience is as valuable or not as anybody else's. So yeah, what you see around you is what it is. There is all this talk of language chauvinism, and in some regions, people will deliberately not speak in the tongue of the outsider, even though they understand it. So I guess a lot of this has to do with resentment at the fact that there are people coming in and trying to compete for your resources. I think that's where it goes. And if you can make it a little difficult for them by pretending not to understand or not allowing them entry unless they can speak your tongue, then it's convenient, right? And eventually, every migrant ends up conforming to local requirements. That's sad but true. It's true even abroad, right? I mean, you go to America and you have to do a lot of things the way Americans do. You can't just retain your Indianness entirely.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Varud, do you have anything to add to that answer?
No, I think the answer actually, the question answered itself, and that it's a very complex topic. Yeah. And it's probably a little bit of all those things combined, and yeah.
All right, thank you. The next question is from Ravi Chandra. Though I'm Ravi Chandra, I just want to tell the audience that this is probably not a question that the panel here is has the authority to answer, but we could, I'll just anyway go ahead and ask it, which is culturalization of caste in India and a sector of community that emigrated to Australia in this age is a worrying trend. How do you think this can be addressed in categoric terms at a policy level in both countries? So if either of you is comfortable answering the policy question, no. We're really sorry, Ravi Chandra.
Sorry.
I don't think this panel is going to answer a policy related question. But if there is something else, please, if there's something related to literature, multiculturalism, etc., you could ask another question, whether it is the central culturalization of caste could be a part of it. We have one question from Kong. I'm so sorry, I probably can't pronounce the complete name right. So I'm just going with the first word. The question is, Varud, I'll probably take this to you, which is continuing with the food metaphor. Would you say that multiculturalism is like a smorgasbord? Many different cuisines available with some dishes influencing others to varying degrees. It may not break down all the barriers, but it may promote better understanding and relations. This sounds like molecular.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I feel like the questions, you guys asking the questions should be on this panel with us, because you're answering very much what you're asking. Yeah, one metaphor I like to use is like when you come to the US, when you go to the UK and you go to an Indian restaurant, what are the most typical things you get? It's chicken tikka masala, saag, and naan bread, right? But the true reality and the beauty of India, and one thing that I've just recently gotten to explore is like, you go to Delhi and in Humayunpur, you have some of the best food from across the Northeast that you can ever imagine. I mean, and sorry, blasphemy maybe, but it's so much better than chicken tikka masala, which we don't have time to discuss the nuances of whether that's even an Indian dish at this point anymore, right? But yeah, it's like there's so much food, and I think, again, the diversity of this country as seen through food, there's a lot. But thank you for the profound question and answer.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I don't think chicken tikka masala is a real dish. We don't find it here in India, definitely.
Exactly.
But is there something that you'd like to add about how one food of one culture might influence the other? Or do you have some perspective on that, to what varying degree? I think that's particularly the question.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I'm going to jump right into chicken tikka masala. Like, if you now look at menus in Delhi, the dishes actually come back and influenced the origination point of where people call it an Indian dish. And I think that's the interesting thing about food, is that you can look at an exodus or a diaspora going out, and what's now happening in the country, and you see this with food, is a lot of things are coming back in and influencing the origination point. And I think that's a very interesting about when we talk about multiculturalism or diversity, is that it's not just kind of a central point going out anymore. You have interminglings, you have the nuances, like if you go to a place like Kolkata, the different enclaves that exist, and you see it with food. And I think that's a remarkable thing.
Yeah, we have the tandoori momos and Szechuan dosas here.
There you go.
Everything is a crossover. So the next question is, what would be your takes on increasing ethno-nationalism in India currently and the stories that are shaping accordingly in the mainstream media? How do we inculcate inclusiveness among students in the light of this? Arunava, do you have a perspective on that?
Well, I can only talk about what I see amongst my students at Ashoka University and elsewhere. And I don't think we have to include it. They're doing it themselves. I think the younger generation is very aware of the problems of this country and what direction to take. And seriously, if we could leave more to them, and put more things in their hands, I feel that, in many senses, we would be in a better space far quicker than the old men, and it's primarily men, who lead India or who have led India in the recent past can ever achieve.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. So there is one very interesting question, and this is quite profound, and we haven't touched upon this while speaking about the partition. I'd probably leave it to the both of you because we discussed this. How do you relate multiculturalism with the partition, whether it is 1947 or 1971's East Pakistan partition? Isn't it going against the essence of the philosophy of multiculturalism itself? So yeah, if you had to bridge the gap, and how do you see it, each of you?
Yeah, well, that's a tough question. I suppose if you look at it only along lines of religion, then yeah, you could say that you are actually unifying people of the same religion in a geographical space rather than ensuring diversity. But it's so much more than that, because religion is a very convenient way to identify and divide people. But the truth is that people are far more similar, far less similar by religion in India, and far more similar by way of their economic class, their social class, their regional moorings, their caste, and so on. And those are the lines along which we really have to conduct our investigations. All religions in India have castes, oddly enough, because it's more ingrained than the external religious or top-down religious layer is. All religions have economic divisions. All religions have linguistic divisions. So those are the lines along which we need to conduct our study of multiculturalism. And there, of course, a partition may have done some things both in 1947 and 1971, but India is still home to the world's largest population of Muslims, for example. So that is something that we have to take into account and respect and acknowledge rather than trying to wish away.
And celebrate, if I may add.
Absolutely, and celebrate and uphold.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And successfully put, like, religion was just one dimension of what happened, and just harping on that one aspect, I think we do a disservice to the time period and the memories that have existed from then.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both Arunava and Varud, for taking that question. Arunava, I think this question's for you again. It comes from Sujata. How do you validate your interpretation when you translate, assuming it is not essentially a literal translation?
Well, it's hard. You just read as best as you can, and then you try to write the book that you've read in a new language. Now, am I a better reader than somebody else? Hard to say, hard to claim. Is anyone equally? No. So I guess you just have to trust and not just me, you just have to trust the translator. But the translator gradually learns how to not put themselves in the foreground, but to read neutrally and to keep the nuances and the options and the ambiguities open. Even if I interpret it one way, I will try not to let my singular interpretation show through and let the capacity or the potential for multiple interpretations remain. So that, in a sense, is the validation. So the validation is not that I'm right, but that I leave it open for everyone to be right in their own way. That's the idea of translation.
Can I ask a question too? Because I think it's very interesting. One thing that I found is that certain words convey different meanings. Certain sentences across languages don't have actually equal kind of parts. I was wondering if you could actually tell me a little bit about translation. Have you encountered this? And like, how do you approach something where, like, maybe the tonality can't be expressed in the translation, or the nuance can't actually come alive? Because I think that's personally fascinating.
Yeah, so first of all, there is a big assumption that I've got the nuance to begin with, and there's nothing to say that I have. But assuming that as a translator, I've caught on to it, you're quite right. The new language may not be able to accommodate that particular idea in the same way. You live with that. But the fact also is that when someone is reading in a different language, you don't exactly expect them to get the same experience as they would if they were able to read it in the language in which the book was first written. Equally, you don't want them also to feel that it is a book written in their own backyard. So if someone's reading a translation from Bangla into English, I don't want them to think that, this book was written right here, like everybody writes in English. I would want them to think that you're visiting a foreign land and everything I'm seeing is new. I don't understand all of it, but I will try to make what I can of it and maybe learn more. So that gives me a certain confidence in sometimes not worrying, not being overly bothered, cowed down by the fact that not everything can be accommodated in the terms of the new language. But equally, there's an opportunity to expand the terms of the new language. So you can introduce notions and ideas into a new language using words that exist there, but are configured in a way that has not been experienced before to bring out entirely new ideas. So that's also quite fascinating. I mean, like Walter Benjamin said a century ago, that if you're translating from Hindi into German, bring Hindi into German, not German into Hindi.
Yeah,
I like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have two questions that are kind of related to literature and racism, one from Kong and one from an anonymous attendee. I'll probably club the questions and both of you can take it if you feel comfortable answering these questions. Kong says, have you compared India's experience with multiculturalism and racism with those of other countries? Example, Malaysia, Australia, UK, and the USA. The second question that has come in from an anonymous attendee is, how has racism been a sole topic in literature? How does the author resolve this issue in a span of some 100 pages? So either of you, if either of you is comfortable taking any of these questions.
Yeah, I don't know if I can accurately speak to the second part, but I think the first part is absolutely, I see it in the US, and I think I've been in a weird place that like, you see the undertones in both places, and we explore this going on. It's like, you can't think that like now racism has gotten worse, right? That's not how it works. It's racism exists and it gets inflamed, and it comes to the surface. And I think both countries are actually battling the same thing in different and similar ways of like, we have this racism that exists, and I think we need to find ways of unpacking it. And I think literature is one way, traveling is another. Talking to the people around you is the most basic way of unpacking something simple like this. I'm sorry, simply packing something complex as is, it's not a simple topic at all.
Yeah. We call it the unothering the other at Belong, hence another.
Perfect tie-in.
Yeah, a perfect time to plug that in, right? Arunava, do you have...
Well, yeah, to the second part, for one thing, I don't think it's the job of literature to provide answers. It is really to perhaps frame the question better. And a book can maybe frame one question. It does not have to be all questions or the only question. So the more we read, the more we understand these questions. But what is also interesting for me is not just the explicit treatment of racism that literature has, but also the implicit expression of it, sometimes even without the author realizing it themselves, because the language is so steeped in racism. An example from Bangla is that there is a phrase churi chamari. So churi is to steal, and the word chamari is added onto it as though it's a package deal. Funnily enough, chamari has nothing to do with churi. Chamari is a reference to it's a caste reference, and it is a reference to chamars, right? And chamars are people who do a certain thing. It has nothing to do with theft whatsoever, but look how easily the language brings them together to take on the values of theft onto that other profession. And this is implicit racism. So sometimes studying the language in which a literature is written can yield great results, and shocking results at that.
Yeah, thanks so much for that perspective, Arunava. There's one last question by Surjit Dogra Danji. Surjit, I'm not very sure if this panel will be comfortable answering this question, but I'll ask it anyway. And if we could generalize the answer, that would work. The question's about the mention of Olympics and sports is great, but the attack on the Dalit hockey player, why did that not unite Indians? So if anybody wants to take that directly, or if you have a perspective on it in general, either of you.
I just think, unfortunately, not enough Indians are paying attention to it. And that's my attempt at generalizing, but I think, yeah, we're just not looking out.
Yeah, I'm going to throw the question back at the questioner and everybody else. Do you think that action against the Dalit player was an aberration, or was it reflective of a general sentiment? The answer to that will tell you where the answer lies.
Right. Thank you so much. We actually have, there are questions flowing in, and do we have a couple of more minutes? Can we take any of these? Arunava and Varud?
Yeah.
Somebody is talking about, does celebrating diversity, multiculturalism in India hindering the ethos and vision of India, or is it adding to it? What could be done to enhance the journey? That was one question. And I'll also club another question. This is Kong asking about, what about multiracial marriages in India? In Malaysia, this is an uncommon, and this is not uncommon, and it does promote better relations between the races, but there's still plenty of racism. can either of you take any of these questions? One about celebrating diversity and enhancing the journey, and the second one is if you have a perspective on multiracial marriages.
Well, I'll give a limited answer from the point of view of translated literature. I'm no expert on anything else. The answer is read more translations. That will reveal to us over and over again just how many different kinds of Indias there are. Yeah. And that we can celebrate and revel in all of them and learn from all of them, and not shy away from them and not try to create a single entity. As for the other thing, I don't think it should even be a subject of discussion. I mean, it's horrifying that in this day and age, in the year 2021, this is actually a subject of legal steps and the police stepping in and so on, when it should be just the opposite. It's horrifying. I mean, this is to be condemned in every possible way.
Right. Thank you.
Sorry, let me clarify. What is to be condemned in every possible way is the fact that there is actually a pushback against marriage that takes place across racial, religious, or any other lines.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm just going to double down on Arunava's first statement. Yes, read more translations, read more diverse perspectives, read more from people who aren't you. It should be a celebration.
Yeah. And travel more and talk to people everywhere. That also.
Ideally, yeah, if you can, and safely, please wear masks, everyone.
Thank you so much for that. I'd like, is there anything that you would, either of you or both of you, like to add before we conclude the session?
Yeah, I do have a request to belong. Next time, let's have the genders represented better on our panels, please.
Definitely. We will make sure that happens. Yeah. Thanks so much, Arunava. Thanks for pointing that out. Varud?
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And a great topic. And thank you very much for Blanc for bringing such topics to the forefront. And I think it is a great discussion to be a part of. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the both of you. And thanks for everybody for attending the session and asking us such interesting questions. Unfortunately, we will not be able to answer a few of the other questions that are there. And for those of you who asked for Manoranjan Vyapari's books, we've left a link on the chat box. You can check it out. For those of you who want to follow Arunava and Varud and belong, we've left all their handles, again pasted them here on Twitter, and you could also download our app Another on Android to read more of these conversations. The conversations that we've had with Arunava and Varud are both on the app as well, and some about partition and translation, among other things. We are also going to, for those of you who asked, we're also going to upload a recorded session, live session on our YouTube channel, House of Belong, a week from now. So you can subscribe to this. You can press on the subscribe button and wait for the notification and check it out when it comes out. If you have additional questions, you can DM the speakers here. If you want to write to us, you can write to us on contact@belong.net. On that note, yes, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Varud. Thank you, Arunava. Thanks for everybody. Thanks to the Australian India Institute for having us here. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, Lasya.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Varud. Bye.